Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. The Shah took the controls himself. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the King of Kings, Light of the Aryans, ruler of Iran for 37 years, climbed into the cockpit of his royal Boeing 727 and prepared to pilot his own jet out of the country. Tears streamed down his face. His wife, Empress Farah, sat behind him. Two planes carried what remained of their fortune to Aswan, Egypt. Outside the aircraft at Tehran's Mehrabad airport, a small group of loyalists watched in silence. There would be no fanfare, no ceremony. The man who had once commanded one of the largest militaries in the Middle East, who had hosted lavish celebrations attended by world leaders, who had ruled with absolute authority backed by the most powerful nation on earth, that man was now fleeing. He would never return. The next morning, Iranian newspapers carried a three-word headline that would become the most famous in the nation's history. The Shah is gone. What followed would reshape not just Iran, but the entire Middle East. American foreign policy and the relationship between the Western world and political Islam. The consequences of that January day in 1979 are still unfolding nearly half a century later. Picture this. It's mid-morning on January 16, 1979 in Tehran. The city, convulsed by months of protests, strikes, and violence, is holding its breath. Everyone knows something is about to happen. At the Shah of Iran palace, the Shah has spent his final night in Iran. He is 59 years old and secretly dying of cancer, a diagnosis known only to a handful of people. For months, he has watched his authority crumble. The army that was supposed to protect him is mutinying. The streets belong to the protesters. The prime minister he appointed just days ago, Shapur Bakhtiar, has demanded that he leave the country as a condition of taking the job. The Shah has been here before. In 1953, he fled Iran after a power struggle with his prime minister. That time, American and British intelligence agents orchestrated a coup that brought him back. That time he returned in triumph. This time is different. This time, even his American allies have concluded there is no saving him. At a conference in Guadeloupe just days earlier, the leaders of the United States, Britain, France, and West Germany agreed. The Shah is finished, and so he prepares to leave. The official story is that he is taking an extended vacation. No one believes it. In homes across Tehran, in bazaars, mosques, and universities, Iranians wait by their radios. In Paris, an elderly cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini, exiled from Iran for 15 years, waits too. He has been directing the revolution from afar, his sermons smuggled into Iran on cassette tapes, his face on posters carried by millions of protesters. The Shah boards his aircraft. He takes the pilot's seat. And at 1:24 in the afternoon, the plane lifts off from Mehrabad Airport and banks toward Egypt. Within minutes, the news spreads through Tehran like fire. To understand why an entire nation celebrated when their king fled, you have to go back to 1953, to a moment when the United States and Britain decided that Iranian democracy was a threat to their interests. Mohammad Mossadegh was Iran's democratically elected prime minister, a nationalist who wore pajamas to official functions and wept openly during speeches. Mossadegh had committed what Western powers considered an unforgivable sin. He nationalized Iran's oil industry, which had been controlled by the British since 1913. Britain, humiliated and desperate to regain its oil revenues, convinced the American CIA that Mossadegh was a communist threat. In August 1953, the CIA and British intelligence launched Operation Ajax, a coup that overthrew Mossadegh and restored the Shah to absolute power. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had been Shah since 1941, when the British and Soviets forced his father to abdicate. But he had been a constitutional monarch, limited by parliament and prime ministers. After the 1953 coup, those limitations disappeared. The Shah ruled alone, backed by American weapons, American advisors, and American money. He created Savak, a secret police force trained by the CIA and Israeli Mossad. Savak became notorious for torture, surveillance, and the elimination of political opponents. Amnesty International documented systematic abuses. Dissidents disappeared, the Shah's prisons filled. At the same time, the Shah pursued what he called the White Revolution, an ambitious modernization program that included land reform, infrastructure development, women's suffrage, and a massive expansion of education. Iran's economy grew. A middle class emerged. Women entered universities and professions in unprecedented numbers. But the modernization came with costs. Traditional merchants in the bazaars lost ground to Western businesses. Religious leaders saw their authority diminished. The gap between the rich and the poor widened dramatically. And everywhere Savak watched. The Shah lived lavishly while many Iranians struggled. In 1971, he hosted a celebration at Persepolis to mark 2,500 years of Persian monarchy, a party that cost somewhere between $100 million and $200 million, with food flown in from Paris while Iranian villages lacked clean water. By the late 1970s, all these grievances had merged into a single, overwhelming demand. The Shah must go. The revolution that drove the Shah from power was unlike anything the world had seen. It began with a newspaper article. In January 1978, a government-controlled paper published an attack on Ayatollah Khomeini, accusing him of being a British agent and a poet of erotic verses. Seminary students in the holy city of Qom took to the streets in protest. Police fired on them. Several were killed. In Shia Islam, mourning ceremonies are held 40 days after a death. When those ceremonies for the Qom victims turned into protests, more people were killed. 40 days later, more protests, more deaths, more mourning ceremonies. The cycle fed on itself, each round of violence producing more martyrs, more anger, more determination. By the fall of 1978, millions were in the streets. Oil workers went on strike, crippling the economy. The Shah declared martial law. On September 8th, a day that became known as Black Friday, soldiers opened fire on protesters in Tehran's Jaleh Square. Estimates of the dead ranged from dozens to hundreds. Rather than crushing the revolution, the massacre inflamed it. The Shah vacillated, he made concessions, then cracked down, then made more concessions. He seemed paralyzed, unable to commit fully to either reform or repression. His American allies were equally uncertain. President Jimmy Carter, who had toasted the Shah in Tehran just a year earlier, calling Iran an island of stability, now urged him to compromise with the opposition. By January 1979, the situation was hopeless. Army units were refusing orders. Soldiers were tearing the Shah's portrait from their barracks walls. Khomeini, from Paris, rejected any compromise. He would accept nothing less than the Shah's departure and the establishment of an Islamic Republic. On January 16th, the Shah accepted reality. When news of his departure reached the streets, Tehran exploded in celebration. People poured from their homes, dancing, singing, embracing strangers. Drivers honked their horns continuously. Portraits of Khomeini appeared everywhere. Statues of the Shah were torn down and dragged through the streets. Not everyone celebrated. There were scattered clashes between loyalists and revolutionaries, but the overwhelming sentiment was jubilation. A regime that had seemed invincible had fallen to the power of sustained popular protest. 14 days later, on February 1st, Khomeini's plane landed in Tehran. Millions lined the route from the airport. When a journalist asked the 76-year-old cleric how he felt about returning after 15 years of exile, he gave a one-word answer that would define the revolution's uncompromising spirit: nothing. The Shah's flight set in motion a chain of events that continues to shape our world. The new Islamic Republic moved swiftly to consolidate power. Revolutionary courts executed hundreds of officials from the old regime. SAVAK was replaced by new intelligence services that proved equally ruthless against different enemies. Women who had worn Western dress were pressured to wear a veil. Political parties that had joined the revolution, hoping for democracy, found themselves suppressed. The Shah wandered from country to country, seeking a permanent home. Egypt's Anwar Sadat welcomed him. Morocco's King Hassan did too. But most nations, wary of angering the new Iranian government, turned him away. His cancer worsened. In October 1979, President Carter reluctantly allowed the Shah to enter the United States for medical treatment. The decision was agonizing. American diplomats in Tehran had warned that admitting the Shah could endanger the embassy. But Kissinger and Rockefeller lobbied hard. The Shah was dying. How could America abandon its longtime ally? On November 4th, 1979, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They seized 52 American hostages and demanded the Shah's return to face trial. Khomeini endorsed the takeover. The hostages would remain captive for 444 days. The hostage crisis consumed the final year of Carter's presidency. A rescue mission ended in disaster in the Iranian desert. Carter lost the 1980 election to Ronald Reagan. The hostages were released on January 20th, 1981. Literally minutes after Reagan's inauguration, a final humiliation engineered by Tehran. The Shah died in Egypt in July 1980, 18 months after his flight from Tehran. He was 60 years old. Before his death, the Shah reflected on his downfall. "I did not know how to speak to my people," he admitted. "I believed that what I was doing was for their own good. I did not realize that I had to explain it to them." Those words capture something essential about his reign, and about the revolution that ended it. The Shah believed he knew what Iran needed: modernization, development, secularization. He may even have been right about some of it, but he never asked his people whether they agreed. He never allowed them a voice. And when they finally found their voice, it swept him away. The revolution, too, claimed to speak for the people. Khomeini promised justice, independence, and Islamic government. Whether the Islamic Republic has delivered on those promises, whether it represents the will of Iranians or merely replaced one form of authoritarianism with another, remains a question that Iranians themselves are still struggling to answer. These are the facts. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi fled Iran after 37 years in power. His departure followed months of mass protests, strikes, and violence that his security forces could not suppress. 14 days later, Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile to establish the Islamic Republic of Iran. These are also facts. The Shah's regime, installed with American and British help in 1953, combined modernization with brutal repression. The revolution that overthrew him brought together secularists and Islamists, liberals and leftists, all united only in their demand that the Shah must go. When he went, the coalition fractured and the clerics prevailed. And this is the consequence we still live with. The Islamic Republic remains in power nearly half a century later. American-Iranian relations remain hostile. The hostage crisis that began 9 months after the Shah's flight poisoned those relations for generations. Every conflict in the Middle East, every negotiation over nuclear weapons, every act of terrorism linked to Iran traces back in some way to that January day when a weeping king piloted his jet into exile. The Shah believed he was building a modern nation. His opponents believed he was destroying their culture and their faith. Perhaps both were right. Possibly neither understood the full consequences of their choices. What is certain is that the world changed on January 16th, 1979, and it has not stopped changing since. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, consider this: a king who ruled for 37 years, backed by the world's greatest superpower, armed with a fearsome secret police, fell to millions of ordinary people who simply refused to stop marching. The Shah had tanks, he had SAVAK, he had American support, but he did not have legitimacy. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. Thank you for spending these few minutes with me. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's story. And if you have a moment, leaving a rating or a comment means more than you might realize. It helps other history lovers find us. And honestly, I read every single one. If this episode made you think, share it with someone who might appreciate it too. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.